This is a TalkStation original podcast.
I initiated the conversation this afternoon when we opened the show, commenting that you'd be joining us, and I wanted to focus on the state races because there's been a lot of conversation about what's happening at the federal level. Of course, there's been a lot of finger pointing at the federal level, but even at the state level, some finger pointing, and predominantly in the direction of the gubernatorial candidate, Mark Robinson, who was soundly defeated by, if I'm not mistaken, close to 800,000 votes. And that, of course, there's a lot of discussion about the cascading effect of that on the lieutenant governor's race, the attorney general's race, and also, if you wish, even the Department of Public Instruction. I contend that's not really the case. I argue that those other races did not do well because I don't think their messaging was that effective. But I'll defer to you on this one. But I think that there is some research necessary about the election this year, particularly in light of the fact that North Carolina went so strongly for Donald Trump. North Carolina is, well, they say schizophrenic, but it is hard to put in a box.
Well, certainly Donald Trump won North Carolina's electoral votes for the third straight time and did it in a more convincing fashion, much more convincing fashion than he did in 2020. Right. One of the reasons that North Carolina was so hotly contested, of course, was that in 2020, Donald Trump won our electoral votes, but it was close. Mm-hmm. Fewer than 75,000 votes, 1.3 percentage points separating him and Joe Biden, which is one of the reasons the Democrats thought that North Carolina was winnable. This time around, the margin much larger between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris at about 200,000 votes, or almost 3.4 percentage points now as more of the votes that weren't counted on election night have come in. It's gone down a little bit, maybe 3.35 points, but still a convincing win for Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. You referenced what happened below Donald Trump on the ballot and how much was it affected by the gubernatorial race. You are correct in the fact that it was a drubbing. Josh Stein, the Democratic Attorney General, over Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, nearly 15 points, 55. Stein was slightly less than 55, but close to 55% of the vote, to 40% for Mark Robinson. Robinson, 7 points or more lower than any other statewide Republican candidate, even the other ones who lost. So definitely a major victory for Josh Stein, major loss for Mark Robinson. How it affected other races down the ballot, not as clear to say. As I look at the rest of the Council of State races, and remember these are the statewide executive branch offices. You referenced some of them, Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor. There's also Secretary of State, Ag Commissioner, and others. I kind of separate them into three different groups. So set governor aside, and there are 9 other Council of State seats, and I put them in groups of 3 because they kind of fall into groups of 3. 3 of them were incumbents running for re-election. Mm-hmm. You had Secretary of State Elaine Marshall, a Democrat, the Agriculture Commissioner Steve Troxler, a Republican, and Insurance Commissioner Mike Causey, a Republican. All of the incumbents won. Troxler, who has traditionally finished with the highest vote total among Republican candidates across the state, did once again, and he had the largest margin of victory, somewhere near 8 points, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. Mike Causey also won fairly comfortably over Democratic State Senator Natasha Marcus, and Elaine Marshall had a closer victory on the other side for the Democrats, but still she won by a couple of percentage points. So the incumbents won. No one unseated an incumbent in these races. Then I put together 3 more of the races that I would call kind of the boring races, in the sense that they got less attention. No one really knew a whole lot about the candidates. There wasn't really much on the airwaves about these races. And in those 3 races, and all of them were to some extent open seats. One of them was an appointed incumbent on the Democratic side who got defeated. But mostly these were candidates who people didn't know. They weren't incumbents. It was basically just decide probably largely based on how you feel about the political parties, with maybe some thoughts about how you feel about the particular candidates and the job at hand. But those were the races for state auditor, state treasurer, and there was one more that's escaping me now. State labor commissioner.
Yep.
And all of those went to the Republicans.
Right.
And these were candidates that on the Republican side who were not seen as particularly controversial, not necessarily getting a whole lot of attention, and they all won.
Yeah,
and then the last three races that I'll throw out there are the ones that were high profile and had some controversial candidates.
Mm-hmm.
These are lieutenant governor. This is the attorney general's race and the superintendent's race. And in all three of these races, the Democrats won.
Right.
Now, some might say it's because Hal Weatherman and Dan Bishop and Michelle Morrow were all tied to some extent to Mark Robinson or to the MAGA brand, and that may have something to do with it. It also may have something to do with the fact that these were more controversial candidates who were really popular with the Republican primary base, but that did not seem to translate as well to a general election audience that was looking for something more middle of the road to some extent.
You know, I just want to make a real quick comment. Those I'll use that description, and you're correct. The boring races, labor, auditor, and treasurer, sadly are, and Secretary of State for all that matters, because a lot of people don't even think about those races. Now, it is interesting that Elaine Marshall's race was as close as it was. She's seen almost as apolitical. She does her job and she does it effectively. I've talked to a lot of attorneys, and they see no problem with her work as the state's Secretary of State. But
and I'll give you an anecdote on that, Lockwood. I talked to a young woman shortly after the election who is probably early mid-30s, considers herself very conservative. She says that, but she voted for Elaine Marshall, and basically she said, you know, I treat that job kind of like a Supreme Court justice.
Right.
Keep that job till you die, unless you do something that's really bad.
Yeah.
And Elaine Marshall hasn't done anything bad, so even this very conservative person was happy to throw a vote to Elaine Marshall.
And the previous state auditor, likewise, of course, she had a bad situation, and that cost her job. And, of course, the governor appointed a Democrat to replace her, who, of course, did, in fact, lose. That was Jessica Holmes. But, you know, the other aspect of this, and I want to go back to the three races you just touched on that were somewhat controversial. The vast majority of the voters had no clue who the lieutenant gubernatorial candidates were, both Hal Weatherman and Rachel Hunt. And, of course, Rachel Hunt's claim to fame, I shouldn't say claim to fame, but the awareness was she is Jim Hunt's daughter. Now, the other topic, Dan Bishop and Jeff Jackson, interestingly enough, coming from pretty much the same geographical region of the state, both members of the U.S. House, and both having, you know, decided to step, well, in the case of Jeff Jackson, he got, for all intents and purposes, gerrymandered, they'll use that term, out of his district. Dan Bishop, it was interesting, both Dan Bishop, Hal Weatherman, and if you really get down to it, Michelle Morrow, for three controversial races, I didn't see a lot of momentum or energy in their races, particularly from the state Republican Party.
That's potentially true. You know, these are races that are going to get less attention than president and governor anyway.
Right.
And I think that as polling went on and it looked closer and closer to Election Day, as if those were races that might not be winnable, that I think Republicans put their money elsewhere. But I do think the candidates themselves also contributed to this. As I said, it's not entirely clear how much being tied to Mark Robinson affected them, because if the Robinson effect were really as much as some people thought it might be, then Republicans would have lost all the way down the ballot after that governor's race. Yeah. And they didn't. They won some big races, including, I think we'll talk in a moment about judicial races.
That's exactly.
But these candidates were the ones who did not succeed, Hal Weatherman, Dan Bishop, and Michelle Morrow. And in some cases, if there was a Robinson effect, you'd think that at least Weatherman and Bishop
right.
were ones who felt the impact of that. Hal Weatherman had buttons made up and signs made up specifically tying himself to Mark Robinson as if they were a ticket, governor and lieutenant governor. And Dan Bishop, who had no competition for a primary and didn't have to go out of his way to tie himself to Mark Robinson, still did.
Right.
He was on tape saying, I endorsed Mark Robinson from the beginning. He said, I want to be his sidekick. And Dan Bishop, Jeff Jackson played into that in his ads. In addition to the ads promoting himself, he basically said, hey, Dan Bishop wants to be Mark Robinson's sidekick, and I'm running to be a normal person. And so that probably had some impact. The degree of impact is hard to say, but it at least probably had some impact on some voters and helped, if not give Jackson the win, at least maybe give him a little bit more of a cushion. Because of those three races, even though the Republicans lost, it was nowhere near the 15-point loss that Mark Robinson had. Bishop's loss to Jackson was in the neighborhood of 3 points. The Michelle Morrow race was within 2 points. The Hal Weatherman-Rachel Hunt race was also within 2 points. So these were not blowout losses for Republicans, but voters looking at these candidates were not as impressed with the Republicans in these races as they were within the races that, as I lumped together, were kind of more the boring candidates who did not really stand out as especially conservative or especially MAGA.
You know, the topic of the judicial races, I think, is significant, particularly in the judicial race for the state Supreme Court Associate Justice. Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs, that was a very close race.
Well, these judicial races tend to be relatively close, and if you look at all four of the statewide judicial races, it looks as if, barring any last-minute influx of a ton of votes that we are not expecting, that for the third straight election cycle, all of the statewide judicial races are going to go to Republicans. But they're not blowouts. I mean, the largest margin is 52% to 48%, and that was for the one incumbent who won her race 8 years ago running for re-election, Valerie Zachary. In the other two appeals court races, they are 52 to 48 and 51 to 49. Chris Freeman, who knocked off an incumbent in the primary, is going to be a new appeals court judge. And then Tom Murray beat the appointed incumbent, Carolyn Thompson, 51-49 in that race. And then in the Supreme Court race, the incumbent who was appointed, who has not won a general election to any judicial seat, she was appointed first to the Court of Appeals by Governor Cooper, then appointed to the Supreme Court by Governor Cooper, Allison Riggs. She is trying to run for the first time and won her very first election in March by winning a primary, but that was not enough for her to beat Jefferson Griffin, who is ahead right now by 7,600 votes, which seems like an insurmountable obstacle. To me, the difference seems to be that, not in a major way, but certainly in kind of a 51-49 way or a little bit closer, people are more inclined in North Carolina to vote for Republicans than for Democrats in these statewide judicial races. Now, when you go down to the lower level for Superior Court and District Court, it will depend on the county and whether it's a blue-leaning or red-leaning county. But statewide, that Republican judicial brand is slightly better than the Democratic judicial brand, and we've seen that play out now for 3 election cycles in a row. Once Jefferson Griffin joins the state Supreme Court, it will have a 6-1 Republican majority. The only Democrat left will be Anita Earls, who won her seat 6 years ago with less than 50% of the vote, because your listeners might remember there were 3 people in that general election: Earls, the Democrat, Barbara Jackson, a Republican, and then a fake Republican, Chris Anglin, who took away some of the vote and helped Earls win.
I love that description, fake, because he had been a Democrat. Yeah.
He had been a Democrat, and his campaign manager and his campaign lawyer were Democrats through and through.
Very operatives. All right. You know, the other aspect of this, and with about a minute to go, the interesting aspect is that the judicial races are seen from a different perspective than the other elected races. Yet I contend that the vast majority of the voters have very little understanding of what the judicial races actually, what the job entails.
I would say that's absolutely true. And for some reason, when they go to vote, they say, would I rather have a Republican judge or a Democratic judge? And about 51 to 49 to 52 to 48, they say, I'd rather have a Republican judge.